Hello everyone! Today I'm going to talk to you about how the British Raj was really bad for India. Okay, let's start off straight away. So my very first argument is going to be the economic argument. When Britain arrived on India's shores around the year 1750, India's share of global GDP was about 24%. By the time India gained independence in 1947, that number had shrunk down to just a small mice number of 4%. Not only the share of the global GDP, but the standard of living of each individual Indian also fell during these 2 centuries, to the extent that clearly gives the evidence that what the British was doing was actually povertizing the individual. During the ongoing campaign of looting, plundering, deindustrializing, and povertizing the country. Now, the argument that most people from Britain or the West would make is that India was an agricultural-based economy, so of course it would not be able to compete with an industrialized economy like Britain. That is true, of course, but the reality is that Britain threw India under the wheels of the bus of the Industrial Revolution in which it was seated. So India couldn't industrialize itself. The reason behind why this happened is many of the British East India Company officials came and broke down the looms of the weavers that had been weaving this so-called fine muslin, lightest veneer as it was, and they came, smashed their looms. In one notorious incident, even broke the thumbs of those weavers so they couldn't weave again even after their looms were repaired. They imposed tariffs and duties on Indian exports and lifted tariffs and duties on British exports to India, and therefore those weavers became beggars, and India went from having 27% of world trade to just 2% by the time it gained independence in 1947. The situation became so horrible that the Indians themselves couldn't produce the clothes that they needed to wear, so they had to import a lot of them from Britain. Cities like Dhaka and Murshidabad were depopulated because of this, as they were completely dependent upon the exports that India had been making for nearly 2 millennia. Another off-topic fact to know is that there have been recorded cases of senators debating about the amount of gold that was sent out from Roman Empire to India in order to purchase this fine muslin because of the wants of the Roman women. Not only the textile industry, but many other industries such as the shipbuilding industry also got completely demolished. These industries were systematically destroyed by the British East India Company, and this continued to happen even after the British East India Company was banned and its rule was replaced directly by the British Crown. Britain didn't even treat Indians as citizens. Frequently, you could find signs like "No dogs" and "Indians allowed in this whatever." Despite what many might think, racism and massacres were the reality of the colonial experience. Between 15 and 35 million Indians starved to death in British-induced famines throughout the entire 2 centuries. Even the people of Ireland were devastated by the British policies, which led to the independence of Ireland. In one notorious incident, 4.3 million Bengalis starved to death because Winston Churchill deliberately decided to reroute essential wheat from Bengal to Europe during the Second World War as a reserve stockpile to serve the purpose of a possible future invasion of Yugoslavia, which never took place. Later, when Australian ships were docking on Calcutta port in order to deliver wheat, Churchill ordered those ships to sail on to Europe and add to his reserve stockpile. He said that the starvation of any underfed Bengalis mattered much less to him than that of sturdy Greeks. That's his actual quote. When other people were questioning about his actions, he said it's the fault of the Bengalis themselves for breeding like rabbits. Hold on, Mr. Churchill. You said that during the Second World War, the most notorious war of history, I'm pretty sure that you would have taken some sort of data, or I hope it's not completely backed up by racism. So I looked into the facts, and I found out that between 1750 and 1950, Britain's population had grown about 360%, while India only had grown by 140%. clearly telling us who the real rabbits were. Not only that, Britain left no chance of lying to Indians the entire time. Take World War I as an example, where Britain promised India to give its independence if Indians were to help Britain. In response to that, 1.3 million Indian personnel voluntarily decided to fight with Britain against the Axis. India supplied ammunition, food, animals, packed clothing, even railway lines ripped out of the ground and sent to aid the whole effort. In total, the amount of aid that India had given to Britain during the First World War in today's money is worth about $110 billion, more than many of the world's economies. But instead of getting independence, India got something completely the opposite of that on the 13th of April, 1919. Yes, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in the city of Amritsar, where 1,000 people were slaughtered, that included women, men, children, and the elderly, without any care. And when General Dyer, the person who was responsible for this firing, was asked that if he could have taken the machine gun inside, would he have used it? And his response was yes. Despite having the blood of 1,000 people on his hands, no action was taken against him. He was even praised in the House of Lords in the British Parliament at that time, when one newspaper printed an article titling, "The Man Who Saved India." Really, Britain? Really? Another thing I would like to point out is the partition of the subcontinent. Now, the facts that you would have heard is that there were many riots happening in the subcontinent, so the British had to separate British India into India and Pakistan. That is actually half true. The reality is a bit different. The reality is that British had always been responsible for many of the riots that had been taking place between Indians. Hindu versus Muslim wasn't the only one. There were many other things that were happening in the country as well. The riots had become too notorious enough to be ignored, so the partition had to take place. And it happened very quickly. And how quickly, let me tell you. Britain had a population of 50 million people, and it was governed by hundreds of people in its parliament. And the government lasted for 5 years to take any big decision. But in the case of India's partition, one man was sent to India to divide the subcontinent into two different countries by looking at population, irrigation systems, and other factors, including geography, to decide the future of 350 million people and its generation until eternity. Just one person. He was just given 36 days to do his job, and he completed in 33. This explains how eager the British were to divide the country and leave it to its doom, which did happen just a year later when the both countries started fighting each other over Kashmir, because Pakistan decided to invade Kashmir when Kashmir wanted to stay neutral. But hold on, Kush. I should also be mentioning the good things that Britain left India. Well, the fact is, when I went researching into these good things, I found more bad things about them than they were good. So I present to you one of the biggest areas of argument the apologists like to argue about, and that is the railways. Well, the fact is, the railways were really built to extract raw materials and resources from the Indian hinterland and to be transported to the ports so that it could be shipped to Britain and then manufactured there and sold worldwide. They had nothing to do with what India wanted. The Indian Railways offered massive incentives to British firms, with the result that you actually had 1 kilometer of Indian Railways costing twice what it would have been to build the same kilometer in Canada or Australia, because so much money was being laid off in those extravagant returns, guaranteed out of Indian taxpayers. What about the education that British left India, leaving the English language? Well, the fact is, the British hardly spent any money on education. And one good example is that only 17% of Indians were literate at that time, with very, very few being able to read and write in English. Will Durant, an American historian, pointed out that as late as 1930, the entire British education budget, all the way from preschool till the highest universities, was less than half of the high school budget of the state of New York. That's how less amount of money the British were spending. This reminds me that Britain had been spending very, very few amount of money on the healthcare as well, as the life expectancy of Indians was just 27. A very, very far small number than what was in 300 BC in India. There's also a mention of democracy. Well, I'm not an expert in this area. Let me just show you a small section of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's speech at Oxford University and judge by yourself what do you think about this.
It's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it.
Perfect. What a perfect argument that he has made. I couldn't have done better than this, so I gave him the opportunity to express his words to you. What about the argument that British actually helped uniting and piecing together the countries into India and Pakistan? Well, the reality is far different from that. In the official agreement of the Act of Indian Independence, the 650 Indian kingdoms were given the right to either join India or Pakistan or become their own independent nations, which gave the right to the question is that how many countries are becoming independent? 1, 2, or 652? Yes, because those 650 different princely states could have actually become their own individual countries. Luckily, the established Indian and Pakistani central governments did the good job of being able to persuade these 650 kingdoms to joining on their side. If they weren't able to do so, then the map of India wouldn't have looked like this. It would have looked like this. The British actually did not help India to unite. It only established a central government that did the job of uniting the country together, and that with limited franchise. All the main institutes such as the Indian Institute of Technology and the Indian Institute of Management were established by the Indian government after independence. So giving the credit of India's literacy and economic growth to Britain is completely wrong. It is as wrong as saying that Brexit never happened. In the views of many people in the West, Britain was a far better colonist than many others. Well, as an Indian, I would like to say I would have every single one of my family members being born in an independent country, not ruled by any foreign power, especially not by a colonist that uses the money paid by Indian taxpayers and gives the credit of building the infrastructure out of that money to itself. Definitely not a country that I would rather be colonized by. One other fact that I'm really mad about is that Britain does not teach the current generation about the horrors and atrocities of the colonial era. The complete opposite of that is true in Germany, who does teach everything about its 20th century history. On the other hand, Britain does not like to talk about it, as it's something embarrassing. One great example about this is that BBC annually presents a very small documentary on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, but never has it ever presented a small documentary on the anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So this results in many British people, especially politicians, making the argument that Britain is one of the only few countries in the European Union that has nothing to hide and to be shameful about its history. Really, I think you need to go back and read books properly. And if you haven't, well then start on. Why can't you? So, at the end of this, what comes to my mind is that Britain should help India in the form of reparations. This value is way too big for Britain to be able to afford, so it can pay it off over the course of the next 200 years. Even this amount is not going to be large enough to atone for the wrongs that have been done, as no big amount can retrieve back the dead that were completely innocent and were killed in British disasters. But an amount can be big enough to help India get out of its poverty, as this problem is rooted back long ago because of the British. Because when it left India, 90% of India's population was living below the poverty line, which the Indian government was able to help to reduce to just 20%. Yes, that does leave a very big 20% that is still living below the poverty line, but in the past 70 years, this figure has gone down by about 1% annually. Still, Britain is the one that is mainly responsible for this problem. It can't just blame all that on the Indian government. There is always so much that can be done. And what can be done can be helped by British reparations to India. And I would like to add that whenever there are documentaries being made about poverty in India, never do they mention the fact that this problem has been rooted long ago and was created by the British. Because when that will happen, documentaries will be full more of curses to Britain rather than talking about the reality of the corruption in India. And they can't afford to do that because they don't want to upset Britain. Well, what about the aid that Britain has given to India? Well, let me bring out Mr. Shashi Tharoor again and let you hear what he has to say about this.
Well, let me just point out that British aid to India is about 0.4% of India's GDP. The government of India actually spends more on fertilizer subsidies, which might be an appropriate metaphor for that argument.
That's just perfect in the way it is. Britain's help to India is just about the same as the amount of help Mr. Bill Gates would be getting if he had received a donation of $1. So at the end of the day, what I would like to say is that the British Raj was really, really bad for India. It used the country's own money to build the country while heavily benefiting from the loot, the plunder, and the deindustrialization that it was causing in the 2 centuries, which resulted in giving a very big thrust to the British Industrial Revolution, which was fueled by the depredations that Britain had been causing in India throughout the 2 centuries.
And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark.
Thank you for your attention. Hope you will like it, subscribe to my channel, and hit the like button. See you next time for another interesting video.